Have you ever wondered why you exist at all? Not in some philosophical sense, but literally. Why your specific combination of genes survived when so many others didn't? Why the particular branch of the human family tree that leads to you made it through the bottlenecks and catastrophes and close calls that define our evolutionary history? Here's something that might change how you think about that question. Between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago, there were at least 4 different types of humans walking the Earth at the same time, not subspecies, not variations, different species of human, and they met, they interacted, and in some cases, they interbred. The Neanderthals weren't some primitive dead end. They were successful, sophisticated humans who had survived in Europe and Asia for more than 300,000 years before your ancestors even left Africa. They had bigger brains than you do. They had complex tools, burial rituals, possibly language, maybe even art. They were doing just fine, and then they weren't. Within about 10,000 years of modern humans arriving in their territory, the Neanderthals were gone, extinct, every last one of them, except for the fragments of their DNA that approximately 2% of people carry today, scattered through genomes like archaeological traces of an encounter that changed everything. What happened during those 10,000 years? What was it like when 2 types of humans who hadn't shared an ancestor for 500,000 years suddenly found themselves sharing the same caves, hunting the same herds, competing for the same resources? The answer isn't what you might expect. It's stranger, more complex, and more human than the simple story of conquest or displacement we used to tell. Because here's what we now know. Your ancestors didn't just meet the Neanderthals. They lived alongside them for thousands of years. They traded with them. They learned from them. And yes, they had children with them. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. So maybe subscribe and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always check the comments and it's fascinating. Sydney at dawn, Toronto at midnight, Berlin in the quiet hours before sunrise. All of us carrying DNA from an encounter that happened 45,000 years ago, trying to understand what it meant when 2 types of humans met in the cold European twilight. Over the next 2.5 hours, we're going to walk through that meeting. We're going to explore what life was like 45,000 years ago, when the Earth held multiple types of humans and the future wasn't certain. We're going to trace the evidence piece by piece, trying to understand not just what happened, but what it felt like. What it meant to be human in a world where human came in different forms. We'll explore the Neanderthals themselves, who they were, how they lived, what made them different from and similar to your ancestors. We'll walk through the European landscape they called home, the Ice Age world they'd mastered over hundreds of thousands of years. And we'll try to understand the modern humans who arrived from Africa, bringing different tools, different strategies, different ways of thinking about the world. Then we'll look at the encounter itself, the archaeological sites where both types of humans lived, the genetic evidence of interbreeding, the transfer of technologies, the slow, complex process by which one type of human replaced another over millennia. And finally, we'll explore what this all means for you, why it matters that you carry Neanderthal DNA, what this ancient encounter tells us about being human, about difference and similarity, about survival and extinction, about the strange, complicated story of how you came to exist at all. So get comfortable, let your breathing slow. We're going back 45,000 years to a time when being human was more complicated, more diverse, and more uncertain than it is today, to a moment when your direct ancestors stood face to face with another type of human and made choices that shaped your existence. The story begins not with a meeting, but with a world. Picture Europe 45,000 years ago. This isn't the Europe you know. The geography would be recognizable, the general shape of the continent familiar, but almost everything else would be alien to modern eyes. This is the late Pleistocene, deep in the grip of what we call the Ice Age, though that term doesn't quite capture the reality. The ice comes and goes in cycles spanning tens of thousands of years. Right now, around 45,000 years ago, we're in what's called an interstadial period, a temporary warming between the deeper freezes. But temporary is relative. This warm period will last for thousands of years. And warm is also relative. The temperatures are still far below what you'd experience in most of Europe today. The landscape is something called mammoth steppe. Imagine endless grasslands stretching from France to Siberia, broken by scattered patches of pine and birch forest in the river valleys. No dense woodlands like you'd find today. No closed canopy blocking the sky, just open country under vast horizons, cold and dry and rich with life. The life is what would catch your attention if you could stand there looking across this ancient grassland. Herds numbering in the hundreds, sometimes thousands, woolly mammoths moving in family groups, the adults towering 3 meters at the shoulder, their curved tusks catching the low northern light. Woolly rhinoceros, massive and solitary, browsing on the tough grasses. Reindeer in vast numbers, there are migrations defining the seasons. Wild horses, steppe bison, musk oxen, all in greater abundance than you can easily imagine. And the predators. Cave lions larger than any lion alive today, their range extending across the entire continent. Cave bears that could reach 500 kilograms, hibernating in the limestone caves that pockmark the landscape. Short-faced hyenas, different from their African cousins but just as effective at scavenging and hunting. Wolves that would make modern grey wolves look small. This is the world the Neanderthals have mastered. Not just survived in, mastered. They've been here, in this challenging environment for more than 300,000 years. Think about that. When your ancestors were still in Africa, still adapting to warmer climates, still figuring out how to hunt large game effectively, the Neanderthals were already expert Ice Age hunters. They'd watched the glaciers advance and retreat multiple times. They'd survived climate swings that would have devastated less adaptable species. Now, on an evening in early autumn 45,000 years ago, let's focus on one specific group. One family of Neanderthals making camp in what will one day be southern France, in a region of limestone cliffs and river valleys that offer both shelter and hunting opportunities. There are 12 of them, 3 adult males, 4 adult females, 5 children ranging from infants to teenagers. This is a typical Neanderthal group size, smaller than the extended family groups that modern humans often form, but large enough to hunt effectively and defend territory. They're settling into a shallow cave for the night, one they've used before. You can tell by the layers of ash in the fire pit near the entrance, by the scatter of stone tools left from previous visits, by the bones split open for marrow and then discarded. This is what archaeologists call a habitual use site. Not a permanent home, but a regular stopping point in the seasonal round of movement that defines Neanderthal life. The eldest male, somewhere in his late 30s, old for a Neanderthal, is rebuilding the fire. He's done this thousands of times. The movements are automatic, efficient. First the tinder, dry grass gathered earlier in the day and kept in a leather pouch. Then the striker, a piece of iron pyrite he's carried for years, worn smooth from use. A few sharp strikes against a piece of flint, sparks falling into the tinder, a careful breath to encourage the flame. Within minutes, the fire is burning, pushing back the cold that comes quickly once the sun drops. The others are busy with the evening routines. 2 of the women are butchering a reindeer killed late in the afternoon, their stone tools, carefully shaped blades of flint, moving with practiced precision. They're not just cutting randomly. They know exactly where to cut to separate muscle from bone, how to efficiently strip pull meat, how to crack long bones to access the rich marrow inside. This knowledge isn't instinctive. It's learned, passed down through generations, refined over hundreds of thousands of years. One of the younger males is working on a spear, replacing a broken stone point with a fresh one. He's using a technique called hafting, binding the stone point to the wooden shaft with sinew and resin. It's delicate work, requiring patience and fine motor control. He's done this before many times, but each spear is unique, each piece of wood and stone slightly different, requiring adjustment and attention. The children are playing, sort of, The older ones are practicing with small spears, throwing at a patch of moss on the cave wall, trying to hit the same spot repeatedly. The younger ones are closer to their mothers, one infant nursing, the others examining stones and bones and whatever else catches their interest. This isn't idle play. This is how Neanderthal children learn. By doing, by imitating, by trial and error, under the watchful eyes of adults. Watch them for a while. Watch how they communicate. There's speech, certainly, though we'll never know exactly how it sounded. The anatomy is there. Neanderthals have the same FOXP2 gene that modern humans need for complex speech. They have the same descended larynx, the same tongue structure. But language is more than anatomy. It's culture, syntax, accumulated meaning. Did they have words for abstract concepts? For past and future? For things they'd never seen but could imagine? We don't know for certain, but there's more than speech. Watch the gestures, the glances, the small adjustments of posture that communicate volumes without words. The eldest male shifts his position slightly, and two of the others immediately understand it's time to add more wood to the fire. One of the women makes a soft sound, and the children know to move back from the butchering site. This is the language of people who've lived together all their lives, who know each other's patterns and preferences intimately. And watch their faces. This is crucial. Neanderthal faces were different from yours. The heavy brow ridge that gives them their classic appearance in museums, the larger nose, possibly an adaptation to humidify cold, dry Ice Age air. The face that projects forward rather than being flat like modern human faces. But different doesn't mean less expressive. The same muscles control expression. The same social needs drive communication through facial movement. When the woman smiles at her infant, when the man frowns in concentration over his spear, these are human expressions, recognizable across 500,000 years of separate evolution. As the night deepens and the temperature drops, they gather closer to the fire. This is the social time, the time when knowledge gets transferred, stories get told, bonds get reinforced. We don't know what they talk about. We can't know. But we can infer from what we know about all human societies. They probably discuss the hunting, replay the afternoon's successful chase, plan tomorrow's route. They might talk about other groups they've encountered recently, relationships and alliances that need maintenance. They might share information about the landscape, where water can be found, where good stone for tools exists, where predators have been seen. Or they might just sit in comfortable silence, the fire crackling, the stars emerging in the enormous sky above. The sounds of the Ice Age night, distant wolf howls, the trumpet of a mammoth, the rustle of wind through grass washing over them. This is their world. They're successful here. More than successful, they're thriving. The archaeological evidence is clear on this point. Neanderthal populations around 45,000 years ago are stable, possibly growing slightly. They're not a species in decline, not a doomed lineage limping toward extinction. They're doing what they've always done. Hunting, gathering, raising children, adapting to seasonal changes, maintaining their territory. They have no way of knowing that everything is about to change. About 3,000 kilometers to the southeast in the Levant, the region that today includes Israel and Lebanon and Syria, something is happening. Modern humans, anatomically and behaviorally like you, are beginning to push out of Africa, not for the first time. There were earlier attempts, earlier migrations that didn't take hold, but this time is different. This time they're going to keep going. They're going to spread across Europe and Asia. They're going to reach Australia. They're going to cross into the Americas. They're going to become the only type of human left alive. But that's still thousands of years in the future. Right now, around 45,000 years ago, the modern humans moving into the Levant are just one more group trying to make a living in the difficult late Pleistocene world. They don't know they're going to change everything. They're just looking for food, shelter, mates, just trying to survive. The first meetings probably happen at the margins, the edges of territories, places where both types of humans might hunt or gather seasonally. Picture it, a modern human hunting party tracking a herd of gazelles through rocky terrain in the Levant. They follow the animals into a valley, and there, already hunting the same herd from another angle, is a Neanderthal group. What happens next? We don't know exactly because no one was there to record it. But we can piece together likely scenarios from what we know about human behaviour, about territoriality, about first contact between groups. Maybe they avoid each other, each group watching the other warily, keeping distance, waiting to see who gets the kill. When one group succeeds, the other melts away, looking for other opportunities. This is probably the most common scenario. Two groups of predators, both human, both intelligent enough to recognise the other as potential competition, neither eager for confrontation when other options exist. Or maybe they fight. Competition over the kill turning violent. Stone-tipped spears flying, clubs swinging, the brutal close-quarters combat that humans are unfortunately very good at. Someone dies, maybe several people, the survivors retreat, nursing wounds, remembering the encounter, passing down the story of the others, the strange humans who look almost familiar but not quite, who hunt the same game, who are dangerous. Or maybe, just maybe, they approach each other carefully. Weapons lowered but ready, gestures of peaceful intent, an attempt at communication, not full language. The syntax would be too different, the sounds unfamiliar, but the universal human language of gesture, expression, demonstration, the offer to share the kill, the beginning of something that might become trade or alliance, or at least coexistence. All three scenarios probably happened at different times, in different places. Conflict, avoidance, cooperation, the full range of human responses to the other. Because here's what the genetic evidence tells us clearly. Modern humans and Neanderthals didn't just meet once, they met repeatedly over thousands of years, across a vast territory stretching from the Middle East into Europe. And some of those meetings were intimate enough that children resulted. The genetic signature is unmistakable. If you're of European or Asian descent, you carry between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA. It's not evenly distributed. Some genes from Neanderthals proved useful and spread widely. Others were selected against and disappeared. But the overall pattern is clear. Your ancestors didn't just encounter Neanderthals, they had children with them. Those children survived to reproduce. And some tiny fraction of Neanderthal genetic material has been flowing through modern human populations for 45,000 years. This complicates the simple story of replacement. It's not modern humans arriving and wiping out the Neanderthals. It's not a war of extermination. It's something more complex, more gradual, more human. It's two populations meeting, sometimes fighting, sometimes cooperating, sometimes producing children together over millennia. But here's the mystery we're still trying to solve. If they could interbreed, if they did interbreed, if some level of gene flow was happening between the populations, why did Neanderthals disappear? Why didn't they persist either as a distinct population or fully merge with modern humans? What happened during those 10,000 years between first contact and Neanderthal extinction? Yet let's go back to that Neanderthal family in their cave in southern France. The fire is burning low now. Most of them are asleep, huddled together for warmth against the cold night. One adult stays awake, keeping watch, tending the fire. This is how they've survived for hundreds of thousands of years. This is what worked. But worked is past tense. In a few thousand years, there will be no more Neanderthals keeping watch through the Ice Age night. The last one will die somewhere in southern Spain or perhaps Portugal in a cave that archaeologists will one day excavate and date to around 37,000 years ago. The species that survived the worst the Ice Age could throw at them, that adapted to climates ranging from Mediterranean warmth to near Arctic cold, that hunted mammoths and cave bears and survived alongside cave lions and hyenas, will be gone. And the question that keeps researchers awake at night, the question we're going to explore over the next few hours, is why? What happened? What advantages did modern humans have that made the difference? Was it technology, social organization, language capabilities, population size, climate change, disease, or some combination of all of these, a perfect storm of factors that individually might have been survivable but together proved fatal? Before we can answer that question, we need to understand both populations better. We need to know who the Neanderthals really were, not the primitive cavemen of popular imagination, but the real, complex, successful Ice Age humans. And we need to understand the modern humans arriving from Africa, what made them different, what strategies and capabilities they brought with them. We need to reconstruct the world they shared, the Europe of 45,000 years ago, with its peculiar climate and ecology, its opportunities and challenges. We need to look at the archaeological sites where both types of humans left traces, trying to read from scattered stones and bones and ash layers what daily life was like, how these people interacted, what they valued, how they survived. And we need to follow the story forward, watching as Neanderthal sites become fewer and fewer, as modern human sites multiply, as the genetic and cultural landscape of Europe transforms irreversibly. We need to trace the mechanisms of replacement, the ways in which one population came to dominate while the other faded into extinction with just a ghost of DNA left behind. But most importantly, we need to recognize what this story tells us about being human. Because Neanderthals weren't almost human or proto-human or some inferior version of humanity. They were human, fully, completely human, just a different type than we became. They loved their children and buried their dead and made art and told stories and struggled to survive in an unforgiving world. And they met another type of human, another way of being human, and the encounter changed everything. You exist because of that encounter. Because modern humans survived it, adapted to Europe, spread across the world. Because some Neanderthals chose or were forced to interbreed with the newcomers, adding their genes to the mix. Because in the complex dance of competition and cooperation and replacement, the particular combination of traits that defines modern humans proved just slightly more successful in the rapidly changing world of the late Pleistocene. This isn't a story about better and worse, it's a story about what works and what doesn't in specific circumstances, about the role of chance and choice and climate in shaping outcomes, about the thin line between survival and extinction that all species walk. The Neanderthals in their cave 45,000 years ago don't know any of this. They don't know about modern humans in the Levant slowly expanding their range. They don't know that their descendants will one day stop existing as a distinct people. They don't know that some tiny fraction of their genetic legacy will survive into the present, scattered through modern genomes like memories of a world that's gone. They just know this. The fire is warm, the children are safe, tomorrow they'll hunt again. For tonight they've survived another day in the Ice Age. That's enough. It's always been enough. But the world is changing, slowly at first, then faster. And in ways that neither they nor the modern humans approaching from the south can fully anticipate or control, the encounter is coming. The meeting between two types of human that will determine which version of humanity persists into the future. And we're going to walk through it, piece by piece, trying to understand what happened when your ancestors met their distant cousins under the vast Ice Age sky. The night deepens around that Neanderthal cave in southern France. The stars wheel overhead, the same constellations that modern humans in the Levant are also watching, though from a different angle, under a slightly warmer sky. The mammoth steppe stretches away in all directions, cold and dark and alive with the sounds of animals that will one day exist only as fossils. Two types of human, separated by 500,000 years of evolution, moving through the same world, not yet aware of each other, both confident in their ability to survive whatever challenges come. The story is about to begin. The encounter that will reshape humanity is approaching, and nothing will ever be quite the same again. Before we can understand what happened when modern humans met Neanderthals, we need to explore who the Neanderthals actually were, not the slouching, grunting cavemen of old museum dioramas and cartoons, but the real people. The Ice Age humans who survived and thrived for more than 300,000 years before modern humans even left Africa. And here's where the story gets fascinating, because almost everything you think you know about Neanderthals is probably wrong, or at least incomplete. The image of primitive brutes living harsh, short lives in caves is a Victorian fantasy that modern archaeology has systematically dismantled over the past few decades. The real Neanderthals were sophisticated, successful humans with complex behaviours and capabilities that rival and sometimes exceed those of early modern humans. Let's walk through what we actually know about them, building from their physical characteristics to their behaviour to their culture to the unique challenges of reconstructing a vanished people from fragmentary evidence. Start with the body, the Neanderthal skeleton. If you could meet a Neanderthal face to face, the first thing you'd notice is that they're built differently than you. Not grotesquely, not like some completely alien creature, but distinctly different in ways that reflect hundreds of thousands of years of adaptation to the European Ice Age. They are shorter than the average modern human, but massively more robust. A Neanderthal male might stand around 165 to 168 centimetres, about 5 feet 5 to 5 feet 6 inches, but that relatively short frame carries significantly more muscle and bone mass than a modern human of the same height. A typical Neanderthal male might weigh 75 to 80 kilograms of solid muscle and heavy bone. Their bones are denser, thicker, built to withstand enormous physical stress. The skull is the most distinctive feature. That heavy brow ridge you see in every reconstruction, it's real and it's prominent. The skull is longer from front to back than a modern human skull, lower in the vault, with a distinct bulge at the rear called an occipital bun. The face projects forward rather than sitting flat beneath the forehead. The nose is large. Some researchers think this was an adaptation to humidify and warm the cold, dry Ice Age air before it reached the lungs. But here's what's really interesting. That skull contains a brain, and that brain is, on average, slightly larger than yours. Neanderthal brain volume averages around 1,500 cubic centimetres, compared to about 1,350 for modern humans. Now, brain size doesn't directly equal intelligence. Organisation and structure matter more than raw volume. But the idea that Neanderthals were somehow mentally inferior to modern humans? The physical evidence doesn't support it. The body continues to show Ice Age adaptations. The chest is barrel-shaped, providing more lung capacity for demanding physical activity in cold environments. The pelvis is wider, possibly to support the massive leg muscles needed to move that heavy body through difficult terrain. The arms and legs show pronounced muscle attachment points, places where muscles connect to bone that are enlarged and roughened from constant heavy use. And the hands. The Neanderthal hand is fascinating. It's broad and powerful, with a grip strength that would make modern humans look weak by comparison. But it's also capable of fine manipulation. The same hands that could break bones to extract marrow could also carefully shape delicate stone tools. The same grip that could drive a spear into a charging animal could also craft a bone needle for sewing hides together. This combination of raw power and fine motor control tells us something important about Neanderthal life. It was physically demanding in ways that modern human life rarely is. The constant wear on bones, the muscle development, the robust skeletal structure, these don't develop from a sedentary lifestyle. Neanderthals were moving constantly, using their bodies hard, surviving through strength and endurance as much as through intelligence and planning. Now let's look at the evidence of injury and survival. Because Neanderthal skeletons tell a story of lives that were violent, dangerous, and often remarkably long given the risks. Nearly every Neanderthal skeleton we find shows evidence of healed injuries. Broken bones that mended, crushed vertebrae that fused back together, skull fractures that are closed up. These aren't fatal injuries. The individual survived, sometimes for years or even decades after the trauma. Someone cared for them during recovery. Someone shared food with an injured person who couldn't hunt. This is evidence of social support, of care, of what we might call compassion. The pattern of injuries is interesting. Many Neanderthal skeletons show trauma consistent with close quarters contact with large animals. Researchers have compared the injury patterns to those seen in modern rodeo riders, people who regularly get very close to large, dangerous animals. The implication is clear. Neanderthals hunted by getting close to their prey. Very close. Close enough to drive a thrusting spear into a horse or a reindeer or even mammoth. close enough to be kicked, gored, trampled. This was dangerous work. Modern humans, when they arrive in Europe, bring a different strategy, throwing spears that allow them to kill from a safer distance. But Neanderthals perfected the close-quarters approach and used it successfully for hundreds of thousands of years. The injuries tell us it worked, because the individual survived long enough to hunt again and again. Some Neanderthals lived remarkably long lives by Pleistocene standards. We have skeletons of individuals who reached their 50s or even 60s, old age in a world without medicine, without modern nutrition, where every injury could become infected, every winter could be your last. These weren't outliers. Neanderthal populations regularly included older individuals, suggesting stable enough conditions and effective enough social support to allow people to age. Now let's talk about tools, because this is where we can really see Neanderthal intelligence and innovation. The classic Neanderthal toolkit is called Mousterian, named after the Le Moustier site in France where it was first extensively studied. It's sophisticated, complex, the product of highly developed cognitive abilities and manual skills refined over generations. The core technique involves careful preparation of a stone core, usually flint, but sometimes chert or quartzite. The napper shapes the core into a specific form, like a tortoise shell, with careful attention to the angles and surfaces. Then, with precisely placed strikes, they remove flakes that are already the desired shape and size. No extensive reshaping needed. The flake comes off the core ready to use, or needing only minor touch-up. This is called prepared core technology, and it requires planning. You have to envision the final tools before you start, then work backward to create a core that will produce those tools. You need to understand how stone fractures, how force transfers through the material, how to control the angle and strength of your strikes. This isn't random bashing, this is engineering. The tools themselves are versatile. Scrapers for working hides, points for spears, knives for butchering, all produced efficiently from carefully prepared cores. A skilled Neanderthal napper could produce dozens of usable tools from a single good piece of flint. The tools are sharp enough to slice through animal hide and meat, tough enough to scrape hides clean, precise enough for detailed work. And they modified their tools, hafted them to wooden handles to create composite tools, stone points bound to wooden shafts to make spears, scrapers attached to handles for better leverage. This requires adhesive, usually a mixture of birch bark tar, which has to be carefully heated to the right temperature to become sticky without burning. The cognitive complexity of making tar, understanding that heating this specific tree bark produces this useful material, that's sophisticated chemistry by any standard. But Neanderthal technology wasn't static. It evolved over time, showing innovation and adaptation. In some regions, particularly later in their history, we see Neanderthals producing tools that look very similar to those made by early modern humans. Did they invent these independently? Did they learn by observing modern humans? The debate continues, but either answer indicates mental flexibility and ability to innovate. Let's shift now to something that reveals even more about Neanderthal minds, their treatment of the dead. We have clear evidence that Neanderthals buried their dead. Not everywhere, not always, but often enough that it can't be accidental. The bodies are found in deliberate positions, sometimes in caves, sometimes in shallow graves, sometimes with what appear to be grave goods, stone tools, animal bones, arrangements of objects that seem intentional. The most famous example is Shanidar Cave in Iraq. Multiple Neanderthal burials, some with evidence, controversial but revealing, of flowers placed in the grave. Pollen from flowering plants found in clusters around the skeleton, in patterns that don't match natural distribution. The interpretation is that someone placed flowers with the dead body, not for any practical reason, for symbolic reasons, to honour the dead, to mark the transition from life to death. Even if we're sceptical about the flowers, the burials themselves are significant. They require effort, digging in hard frozen ground, moving the body, arranging it carefully. This isn't just disposing of a corpse to avoid attracting scavengers. You could do that more easily by leaving it far from camp. Burial suggests something more, an emotional response to death. a sense that the dead deserve special treatment, maybe even beliefs about what happens after death. We also have evidence of care for the severely injured and disabled. A Neanderthal from Shanidar with massive injuries, crushed skull, useless right arm, probably blind in one eye, who survived to around 40 years old. Someone fed this person, protected them, kept them alive long after they could contribute to hunting or gathering. Another Neanderthal, entirely toothless, who lived for years without functional teeth, meaning someone must have processed their food for them. This is compassion. This is care for community members who can't necessarily reciprocate, who might be a burden on group resources. This is human behaviour, recognisable across 500,000 years of separate evolution. Now let's address one of the most contentious questions. Did Neanderthals have language? The anatomical evidence says yes. Neanderthals have the FOXP2 gene in the same form modern humans have, the gene crucial for the fine motor control needed for speech. They have a descended larynx, creating the necessary vocal tract for producing the full range of human phonemes. They have a hyoid bone, a small bone in the throat that anchors tongue muscles, in the same position as modern humans. They also have the same inner ear structure that modern humans have, suggesting similar sound sensitivity and discrimination. The ear canal is shaped to amplify sounds in the frequency range of human speech. Why would natural selection preserve this anatomy if they weren't using it for vocal communication? But anatomy isn't everything. Parrots have the anatomy for complex vocalizations, but they don't have language in the human sense, grammar, syntax, the ability to combine sounds to create infinite meaning. Did Neanderthals have this? We don't know for certain. We can't know, language doesn't fossilize. What we can say is that their behavior suggests complex communication. The transmission of stone tool techniques across generations requires demonstration and explanation. The coordination needed for hunting large game requires planning and discussion. The social complexity of Neanderthal groups requires negotiation, instruction, the sharing of information about landscape and resources and relationships. Could all of this happen without language? Maybe. Gestures, demonstrations, vocal sounds without grammatical structure could convey a lot. But the simpler explanation, the one that fits the evidence best, is that Neanderthals had language. Not necessarily identical to modern human language. 500,000 years of separate evolution might have produced different syntax, different sounds, different structures, but language nonetheless. The ability to use sound to communicate abstract ideas, to discuss things not immediately present, to share knowledge across time. Let's talk about art and symbolic thought. This is where the evidence gets thin but tantalizing. For years, researchers assumed Neanderthals didn't make art. All the cave paintings, all the carved figurines, all the decorative objects found in Europe were attributed to modern humans. Neanderthals, in this view, lacked the cognitive sophistication for symbolic representation. Then we started dating the art more carefully, and some of it turned out to be older than the arrival of modern humans in Europe. Cave paintings in Spain, simple red lines and hand stencils, dated to more than 64,000 years ago, at least 20,000 years before modern humans reached that region. The only humans in Spain at that time were Neanderthals. We've found perforated shells that appear to be beads, coloured pigments that might have been used for body decoration, scratched patterns on bones and rocks that might be decorative or symbolic. We found evidence that Neanderthals collected unusual objects, fossils, crystals, interesting stones, and kept them, transported them, valued them, for reasons that can't be purely practical. The evidence is controversial. Every example can be debated. But taken together, the pattern suggests that Neanderthals engaged in symbolic behaviour, maybe not to the same extent or in the same ways as modern humans, but symbolic nonetheless. They had thoughts and feelings that went beyond immediate survival needs. They decorated their bodies, marked their territories, created objects with meaning beyond function. This is important because symbolic thought is often considered the hallmark of modern human cognition. The ability to represent one thing with another, to create meaning that's shared within a group, to think abstractly about ideas rather than just concrete objects. If Neanderthals had this capacity, even in limited form, then the cognitive gap between them and modern humans narrows considerably. Now let's consider their diet and subsistence strategies. Neanderthals were adaptable omnivores, but with a strong emphasis on meat. Isotope analysis of Neanderthal bones, measuring the ratios of different elements that accumulate from diet, shows they were eating at the same trophic level as apex predators. They were getting the majority of their calories from animal protein. This makes sense given the Ice Age environment. Plant foods in glacial Europe were limited, especially in winter, but large herbivores were abundant, and Neanderthals became experts at hunting them. Reindeer, horse, bison, mammoth, rhinoceros. We find the bones of all these animals in Neanderthal sites, often with butchery marks showing how they were processed for the meat, marrow, hide, sinew. But they weren't exclusively carnivorous. We're finding increasing evidence that Neanderthals also ate plants, collected shellfish, caught fish and birds, exploited a wide range of food sources depending on what was available. In coastal areas, Neanderthals dove for shellfish. In forest regions, they gathered nuts and berries. They were opportunistic, flexible, capable of adapting their diet to local conditions. They also cooked their food, evidence of hearths, of bones showing heat alteration in patterns consistent with roasting, of starch grains from cooked plants preserved in dental calculus. Cooking increases the nutritional value of food, makes tough plants and meat more digestible, kills parasites. It's a significant technological advantage that Neanderthals clearly mastered. The cooking also tells us something about their social life. A hearth becomes a gathering point. The fire provides light and warmth, extending the useful hours of the day into evening. People sit around fires, process food together, share meals, communicate. The evidence of repeated hearth use at Neanderthal sites suggests this was regular social practice, not occasional activity. Let's talk about their relationship with the landscape. How Neanderthals moved through and used their environment. Neanderthals were mobile but not randomly wandering. They followed seasonal patterns, moving between different sites depending on the time of year, the availability of resources, the weather. Archaeologists call this seasonal mobility, and we can track it through the animal remains at different sites. Summer sites in the uplands where reindeer herds migrated to escape lowland insects. Winter sites in sheltered valleys near water sources that wouldn't freeze completely. Spring and fall sites positioned to intercept migrating herds. The pattern shows planning, knowledge of the landscape, understanding of animal behavior, coordination as groups split and rejoined based on seasonal needs. They had territories, areas they knew intimately, returned to repeatedly, defended when necessary. The distribution of stone tool sources tells us this. We can trace the flint from a particular geological source to sites sometimes 100 kilometers away, showing that Neanderthals transported materials over considerable distances. But not randomly. The same sources appear at the same sites repeatedly, suggesting established routes, known locations, a mental map of territory. They also maintained social networks beyond their immediate group. Stone tools and raw materials moved between regions, suggesting trade or gift exchange, or some form of contact between groups. Nobody lives in complete isolation. All human societies maintain connections with neighbours, exchange information and materials, form alliances. Neanderthals were no different. Now let's address the question of violence. Did Neanderthals fight among themselves? Did they fight with early modern humans? The evidence is ambiguous and sparse, but there are hints. Some Neanderthal skeletons show injuries consistent with interpersonal violence, skull fractures from blows, embedded projectile points. Not many, but enough to suggest that Neanderthals, like all humans, sometimes resolved conflicts through violence. The famous Shanidar skeleton mentioned earlier, the one with massive injuries, some researchers interpret those injuries as battle wounds rather than hunting accidents. The pattern fits better with being struck by the weapons than with animal attack. If true, it means Neanderthals fought each other, possibly in organised conflict between groups. When modern humans arrive, do we see evidence of warfare between the species? direct evidence is almost non-existent. We don't find battlefields, mass graves, clear signs of violent encounters, but absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Most violence in prehistory would be small-scale raids, ambushes, individual confrontations that might not leave archaeological traces. What we can say is that Neanderthals and modern humans coexisted in some regions for thousands of years. If there was constant warfare, we'd expect to see more rapid replacement. Instead, we see a slow, complex process of population change that suggests something more nuanced than simple violent conquest. Let's talk about Neanderthal childhood and learning. Neanderthal children grew up in small, close-knit groups. Their world was one of constant learning through observation and participation. There were no schools, no formal instruction, but the archaeological evidence shows that learning was happening. Knowledge was being transmitted across generations. We can see this in the stone tools. The skill required to produce Mysterian tools doesn't develop spontaneously. It requires years of practice, thousands of repetitions, learning from skilled craftspeople. We find sites with evidence of teaching, cores that were practiced on, failed attempts, the debris of learning. Children probably started young, watching adults work, playing with stone and bone, learning through imitation. As they grew older, they'd take on more responsibility, helping with hide processing, learning to butcher animals, practicing toolmaking under supervision. By their teens, they'd be contributing significantly to group subsistence. The high injury rate suggests children also learn toughness early. Growing up in the Ice Age required physical resilience, the ability to endure cold and hunger and discomfort. But the evidence of care for injured individuals suggests children also learned compassion, social responsibility, the importance of community. We know some Neanderthal children didn't survive. We find their burials, sometimes with what might be grave goods, suggesting grief and ritual even for the young. This is deeply human. The emotional investment in children, the devastation of their loss, the need to mark their passing. Now let's consider a difficult question. Why were Neanderthals replaced? We're getting ahead of ourselves. We'll explore this in detail later. But it's worth noting here that being a successful, sophisticated, well-adapted species isn't always enough. Neanderthals survived the worst climates of the Ice Age. They adapted to environments ranging from relatively warm Mediterranean shores to the edges of the Arctic. They persisted through climate swings that would have wiped out less adaptable species. And yet, they didn't make it. Something about the encounter with modern humans, or the changing conditions of the late Pleistocene, or some combination of factors, led to their extinction. Understanding why requires understanding both populations, the environment they inhabited, the ways they interacted. It requires putting together fragmentary evidence to reconstruct a process that unfolded over thousands of years. But here's what we need to remember as we explore that question. Neanderthal extinction doesn't mean Neanderthals were inferior. It doesn't mean they were primitive or doomed or evolutionary dead ends. They were successful humans who happened to encounter circumstances, ecological, demographic, competitive, that they couldn't overcome. Evolution doesn't favour the best in some absolute sense. It favours what works in specific circumstances, and circumstances change. The traits that made Neanderthals successful for 300,000 years might not have been the traits needed in the rapidly shifting world of the late Pleistocene. That's tragedy, not inferiority. As you're lying there now, perhaps you can appreciate the strangeness of this. You exist because Neanderthals didn't. Or more accurately, you exist because your ancestors were slightly more successful than Neanderthals in the specific conditions of late Pleistocene Europe. A few percentage points difference in population growth rates, compounded over thousands of years, was enough to shift the balance from coexistence to replacement. It could have gone differently. There are possible worlds where Neanderthals survived, where Europe today is populated by descendants of both species, where human diversity includes Neanderthals as a living population rather than a fossil one. The actual outcome wasn't inevitable. It was contingent, dependent on countless small factors and random events and choices made by people who had no idea they were determining the future of human evolution. The Neanderthals in their cave 45,000 years ago, the ones we imagined in part 1, they're real people. Not primitives, not almost humans, but humans. Different from you in some ways, similar in others, shaped by their environment just as you've been shaped by yours. They have thoughts and feelings and relationships. They love their children and mourn their dead, and feel pain and joy and fear and hope. They're trying to survive in a difficult world, using the tools and strategies and knowledge passed down to them by their ancestors stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. They're successful, they're thriving, they have no way to know what's coming. But somewhere to the south, another type of human is expanding into new territory, bringing different tools, different strategies, different ways of organizing society. The two populations are going to meet. They are going to interact in complex ways over thousands of years, and when it's over, only one type of human will remain, except for the 2% of DNA scattered through modern genomes, except for the archaeological sites that preserve their tools and burials and hearths, except for the knowledge we're slowly reconstructing about who they were and how they lived. The Neanderthals are gone, but they're not completely lost. We're still learning their story, still discovering new evidence, still refining our understanding of these Ice Age humans who came so close to surviving into the present. And in that 2% of DNA, in the genes that help modern humans fight disease and regulate immune response and adapt to high altitudes, the Neanderthals are still with us, still influencing who we are, still part of the human story. They were human, fully, completely human, just a different way of being human than what survived into the present. And understanding them, respecting them, recognizing their sophistication and success, that's essential to understanding what happened when the two types of humans met under the Ice Age sky. Let's shift perspective for a moment. We've spent time with the Neanderthals, understanding who they were, how they lived, what made them successful for hundreds of thousands of years in Ice Age Europe. Now we need to turn our attention to the other humans in this story, the ones who arrived from Africa bringing different strategies, different tools, different ways of thinking about the world. The ones who are your direct ancestors. Because here's something that's easy to forget when we talk about the encounter between Neanderthals and modern humans. We're not talking about two alien species meeting. We're talking about two branches of the human family tree that split apart 500,000 years ago and then came back into contact. Cousins, in evolutionary terms. Distant cousins, yes, but still recognizably human in both directions. The modern humans leaving Africa around 50,000 to 60,000 years ago don't look dramatically different from you. If you saw one walking down a street in modern clothes, you probably wouldn't look twice. They were within the range of modern human physical variation, taller and more slender than Neanderthals on average, with flatter faces and smaller brow ridges, but not radically different. Not obviously superior or more evolved, just different. In the way that populations separated by geography develop different physical characteristics. But behaviour, that's where things get interesting. Because the archaeological record suggests that modern humans around 50,000 years ago were doing things, making things, organising society in ways that were new. Not necessarily more intelligent in some absolute sense, but perhaps thinking differently, using their intelligence in different ways, creating new strategies for survival and success. Let's start with where they came from and why they left. Africa has always been the cradle of human evolution. Every major development in becoming human happened in Africa first. The transition to bipedalism millions of years ago, the expansion of brain size, the development of stone tools, the evolution of anatomically modern humans around 300,000 years ago. All of this in Africa. For most of that time, modern humans stayed in Africa. There were earlier attempts at expansion. We find modern human remains in the Levant dating to 100,000 years ago or more. But those early populations didn't persist. They either died out or retreated back to Africa. The expansion that eventually populated the entire planet didn't begin until much later. Why? What changed around 50,000 to 60,000 years ago that made this expansion successful when earlier ones failed? We don't know for certain, but researchers have proposed several possibilities. Maybe population pressure, Africa getting crowded enough that groups were forced to expand into new territories. Maybe climate change, shifts in rainfall and temperature opening new corridors out of Africa, making previously uninhabitable regions viable. Maybe a technological innovation, new tools or strategies that made expansion possible. Maybe some combination of all these factors coming together at the right time. Or maybe it was behavioural. Around this time, we start seeing evidence of what archaeologists call behavioural modernity. Sophisticated art, complex tools, long-distance trade networks, specialised hunting strategies, elaborate burials. Not all modern humans everywhere simultaneously, but enough populations doing these things that it suggests something changing in human culture and cognition. This has led some researchers to propose that something shifted in the human brain around 50,000 years ago. Not a biological change. The anatomy was already modern hundreds of thousands of years earlier. But maybe a cognitive or cultural shift. The development of fully modern language, perhaps. Or new ways of sharing and accumulating knowledge across generations. Or innovations in social organisation that allowed larger, more cooperative groups. The evidence is debatable, but what's clear is that the modern humans who left Africa and eventually spread across the world were doing things that left different archaeological traces than their ancestors. They were innovating, experimenting, creating new solutions to old problems. Now let's follow them as they leave Africa and move into the Levant, the crossroads between Africa and Eurasia. The Levant, modern Israel, Lebanon, Palestine, western Major Syria, is the corridor through which humans must pass to get from Africa to the rest of the world. It's a bottleneck, geographically constrained, and it's where the first sustained contact between modern humans and Neanderthals probably occurred. Picture this region 50,000 years ago. It's not desert like much of it is today. The climate is moister, cooler. There are forests in the mountains, grasslands in the valleys, wetlands near the Mediterranean coast. Game is abundant, gazelles, aurochs, wild boar, deer. It's good hunting territory, capable of supporting both Neanderthal and modern human populations. And here's what the archaeological evidence shows. For thousands of years, both populations are using the same region. Not necessarily at exactly the same time, but alternating. Modern humans occupy a cave site for a few hundred years, then it's abandoned and Neanderthals move in. Or vice versa. Back and forth, sometimes with gaps between occupations, sometimes with overlap. This suggests something important. The region could support both populations, but maybe not simultaneously everywhere. Or maybe there was avoidance, each group keeping to separate territories, meeting occasionally at the margins. Or maybe there was more direct interaction, even cooperation that left no clear archaeological signature. What we can say is that modern humans didn't immediately replace Neanderthals in the Levant. The two populations coexisted somehow for thousands of years, learning about each other, adapting to each other's presence, occasionally interbreeding because we know from genetics that the admixture happened somewhere in this region at this time period. Now let's look at what made modern humans different. What advantages, if any, they brought with them that eventually led to their expansion across the planet while Neanderthals disappeared. Start with tools. Modern human tools around 50,000 years ago are different from Neanderthal Mysterian technology. They're using what's called Upper Paleolithic technology, blade production, where long, thin flakes are struck from carefully prepared cores. These blades are then modified into a variety of specialized tools. The advantage of blade technology is efficiency. From the same amount of raw material, you can produce much more cutting edge. A Neanderthal preparing a core and removing flakes might produce 40 centimeters of usable cutting edge from a kilogram of flint. A modern human using blade technology from the same kilogram might produce 2 to 3 meters of cutting edge. That's a huge difference in material efficiency. Modern humans are also making more specialized tools, not just generic scrapers and points, but tools designed for specific tasks. burins for engraving bone and antler, backed blades that could be hafted into handles, microliths, tiny stone blades that could be combined to create composite tools. This specialization suggests more sophisticated planning, more careful attention to making exactly the right tool for exactly the right job. And they were working with more than just stone. Bone and antler tools become much more common with modern humans. Needles for sewing fitted clothing, harpoons for fishing, spear throwers that increase throwing distance and force. Each of these innovations solves a specific problem, extends human capability in a specific direction. But here's the thing, Neanderthals could make these tools too. We find evidence late in their history of Neanderthals producing blade-like tools, working bone and antler, creating specialized implements. So the difference isn't absolute cognitive capacity. It might be cultural, modern humans having traditions that emphasized innovation and specialization, while Neanderthal culture was more conservative, less focused on tool elaboration. Or it might be demographic. If modern human populations were larger, more densely connected, there would be more opportunity for innovations to spread, for the best ideas to be shared and refined. Neanderthals in smaller, more isolated groups might innovate less, simply because there were fewer people to generate and share new ideas. Let's talk about hunting strategies, because this is where we see some of the clearest differences. Neanderthals, as we discussed, hunted up close. Thrusting spears, close encounters with game, high risk but effective for the large animals of the Ice Age. It worked for hundreds of thousands of years. Modern humans brought a different approach. They developed projectile weapons, spears designed to be thrown from a distance. And then they invented the atlatl or spear thrower, a simple wooden device that acts as a lever, dramatically increasing the force and distance of a thrown spear. With an atlatl you can kill from 30 or 40 meters away, well outside the danger zone for a wounded animal's charge. This is a huge advantage. Lower injury rates mean hunters live longer, hunt more effectively over their lifetime. It means you can take on dangerous prey with less risk. It means the same number of hunters can process more game, because they're spending less time recovering from injuries. Modern humans are also hunting differently in other ways. They're using nets and snares for small game. They're fishing, using bone hooks and harpoons and weirs to catch fish in rivers and lakes. They're hunting birds with specialized projectiles. They're diversifying their subsistence base, not relying so heavily on large game. This flexibility might have been crucial. If large game populations fluctuated, which they did dramatically, with climate shifts during the late Pleistocene, populations that could supplement hunting with fishing and fowling and small game trapping would be more resilient. They'd have backup resources when primary prey became scarce. Now let's consider social organization. This is harder to see archaeologically, but there are hints. Modern human sites suggest larger groups, more people living together, at least seasonally. The sites are bigger, have more hearths, show evidence of more specialized activity areas. This might reflect larger social networks, more complex group structures, better ability to coordinate large numbers of people. Why does group size matter? Several reasons. Larger groups can hunt more effectively, particularly for very large prey like mammoth or woolly rhino. Larger groups can defend territory more successfully. Larger groups have more potential mates, reducing the genetic problems that come from inbreeding in small populations. But larger groups also create challenges. More people means more potential conflict, more need for rules and norms to govern behavior, more complexity in social relationships. Modern humans seem to have developed strategies for managing these challenges. We see evidence of trade and gift exchange and symbolic markers of group identity that suggest sophisticated social mechanisms. Neanderthals lived in smaller groups, maybe 10 to 15 individuals on average. This might have been a constraint of their hunting strategy. Close quarters hunting works best with small, coordinated teams. Or it might have been cultural. Neanderthal society that simply organized differently, preferring smaller, more intimate groups. But smaller groups mean smaller genetic pools, less innovation, less resilience to population shocks. If a disease outbreak or harsh winter kills half your group, A population of 12 is devastated. A population of 50 loses people but recovers. Let's talk about art and symbolic expression, because this is where modern humans really seem different. Starting around 40,000 years ago in Europe, we see an explosion of art. Cave paintings, carved figurines, decorated tools and weapons, jewellery made from shells and teeth and bone. Not just functional objects, but things made beautiful, made meaningful, created to communicate and express and mark identity. The cave paintings are stunning, not crude stick figures, but sophisticated representations of animals, horses, bison, mammoths, cave lions, rendered with attention to anatomy, movement, individual character. The artists understand perspective, shading, how to use the natural contours of cave walls to create three-dimensional effects. And these aren't random doodlings. The caves with paintings are deep, dark, difficult to access. Creating the art required planning, carrying pigments and lighting equipment into the depths, working in cramped, uncomfortable conditions, sometimes for hours or days. This is investment, effort, resources devoted to creating something with no immediate practical value. The paintings must have meant something. Were they ritual sites, places where groups gathered for ceremonies? Were they teaching tools, ways of passing on knowledge about animals and hunting? Were they territorial markers, clan symbols, religious expressions? We don't know, but the effort invested tells us they were important. The personal ornaments are equally interesting. Beads made from shells, teeth, bone, ivory, carefully shaped and pierced for stringing. These take time to make and they serve no practical function. They are purely symbolic, markers of identity, status, group membership. They say something about the wearer, communicate information to others who understand the symbols. Modern humans are also creating music. We find bone flutes, capable of producing multiple notes, requiring skill to make and to play. Music serves no obvious survival purpose, but it creates social bonds, marks ceremonies, expresses emotions that words can't capture. That modern humans invested time in creating musical instruments tells us something about their inner lives, their need for beauty and expression. Did Neanderthals do any of this? As we discussed earlier, there's some evidence they might have. The cave paintings in Spain that predate modern human arrival, the perforated shells that might be beads, the pigments that might have been used for body decoration. But it's less common, less elaborate, harder to definitively establish. Why the difference? Several possibilities. Maybe modern humans had more leisure time. More efficient hunting and gathering strategies left more time for art and expression. Maybe modern human social structures created more need for symbolic communication. Larger groups requiring more elaborate systems of identity markers and status signals. Or maybe, and this is controversial, maybe modern humans had slightly different cognitive abilities. Not more intelligent, but thinking in ways that emphasize symbolic representation and abstract thought more than Neanderthals did. This is hard to prove and easy to overstate. But the archaeological record does show differences in how the two populations express themselves. Let's talk about language again, because if modern humans had any cognitive advantage, it might have been linguistic. We know Neanderthals almost certainly had language, as we discussed. The anatomy is there, the social complexity demands it, the cultural transmission of knowledge requires it. But maybe modern human language was different. More complex, more flexible, more capable of expressing abstract concepts and hypothetical scenarios. This is pure speculation. Language doesn't fossilize. But think about what complex language enables. You can discuss things that aren't present. You can plan for future contingencies. You can share detailed knowledge about distant places. You can create shared mythologies and belief systems that bind large groups together. You can innovate more rapidly because ideas can be explained and refined through discussion. If modern humans had even slightly more sophisticated language, more complex grammar, larger vocabularies, better ability to communicate abstract ideas, that small difference could compound over time into significant advantages. Better coordination for hunting, more effective teaching of skills to children, faster spread of innovations, stronger social bonds across larger groups. But we need to be careful here. It's easy to tell a just so story where modern humans are superior in every way, destined to succeed while Neanderthals were doomed. The reality was probably more nuanced. Neanderthals had advantages too, better cold adaptation perhaps, more robust bodies that could withstand the physical demands of Ice Age life, deeper knowledge of European environments they'd inhabited for hundreds of thousands of years. The question isn't who was better in some absolute sense, it's who was better adapted to the specific circumstances of the late Pleistocene, and circumstances can change. Let's follow modern humans as they move beyond the Levant into Europe proper. This is where the real encounter with Neanderthals begins. The earliest modern human sites in Europe date to around 45,000 to 42,000 years ago. They appear first in the east and southeast, the Balkans, the Danube Valley, and then spread westward over the next several thousand years. By 40,000 years ago, modern humans are in France and Spain. By 35,000 years ago, they've reached Britain and Iberia. This isn't a wave of conquest. It's a slow trickle, small groups pushing into new territory, establishing footholds, gradually expanding. The process takes thousands of years, and during much of that time Neanderthals are still present, still occupying sites, still successfully hunting and gathering. What we see in the archaeological record is a patchwork. Some regions have only Neanderthal sites, some have only modern human sites, some have both, sometimes alternating over time, sometimes contemporary, the two populations living in the same general area. This suggests complex interactions. Maybe some regions were contested, with both populations trying to use the same resources, leading to conflict or avoidance. Maybe other regions were informally divided, each population keeping to preferred territories. Maybe some areas saw peaceful coexistence, even cooperation. The genetic evidence tells us that interbreeding happened. Not constantly, not everywhere, but enough that nearly everyone of European or Asian descent today carries some Neanderthal DNA. This means that at least occasionally, modern human and Neanderthal groups came into contact in ways that were intimate enough to produce children. Think about what that means. These aren't random encounters. For children to result, relationships had to form, maybe through trade, repeated meetings at exchange sites leading to familiarity and eventually attraction, maybe through raid and capture, disturbing to contemplate but common in human history, maybe through deliberate alliance building, groups exchanging members to create social bonds. However, it happened. It happened. Modern humans and Neanderthals, separated by 500,000 years of evolution, found each other attractive enough, familiar enough, human enough to have children together. And those children survived. They reproduced. Their descendants carried both Neanderthal and modern human genes forward into the present. This is profound. It means the boundary between the two populations wasn't absolute. They recognized each other as potential mates, as fellow humans, not as different species that couldn't or wouldn't interbreed. The biological definition of species, populations that can produce fertile offspring together, becomes blurry here. They were separate long enough to develop distinct characteristics, but not so separate that they couldn't exchange genes. Now let's talk about competition. Because however friendly some encounters might have been, modern humans and Neanderthals were ultimately competing for the same resources in the same territories. And competition, when resources are limited, has winners and losers. The primary competition was probably over game animals. Both populations needed protein, needed fat, needed the resources that large herbivores provided. In a given region, there are only so many reindeer or horses or bison. If modern human populations were growing, their hunting pressure would reduce the game available to Neanderthals. This might have been exacerbated by the differences in hunting efficiency. If modern humans with projectile weapons could kill more animals with less risk, they'd process game faster than Neanderthals. Not because individual modern humans were better hunters, but because the technology allowed more kills per hunter over a lifetime. Over time, this would squeeze Neanderthal populations. Not dramatically. not in a way that would be obvious year to year, but 1% lower population growth rate, compounded over 1,000 years, means one population shrinks while the other grows. Eventually, the smaller population starts to fragment. Groups become isolated from each other, genetic diversity drops, resilience to environmental shocks decreases. Climate change might have amplified this. The late Pleistocene was a time of rapid climate fluctuation, cold periods and warm periods alternating on scales of centuries or even decades. Each shift would stress both populations, but populations already under pressure from competition would be more vulnerable. Imagine a Neanderthal group reduced to 8 or 10 individuals because game is scarce, and modern human hunters are taking a share. Then a harsh winter hits, killing half the remaining large game. That small Neanderthal group might not survive. A larger modern human group in the same area, with more diverse subsistence strategies and more social connections to fall back on, weathers the crisis and survives. Multiply this scenario across hundreds of Neanderthal groups over thousands of years, and you get extinction. Not from warfare, not from being hunted to extinction, but from the slow demographic grinding of competition and environmental stress. Groups fail to replace themselves. Populations fragment. Eventually there aren't enough Neanderthals left in enough places to maintain genetic viability, and the last ones die out. This is the most likely scenario for Neanderthal extinction, based on current evidence. Not dramatic, not simple, but the result of complex interactions between climate, competition, demography, and chance. But let's not lose sight of the individual humans living through this. The process took thousands of years. No single Neanderthal would have been aware of it. They weren't watching their species decline. They were just living their lives, hunting, gathering, raising children, dealing with whatever challenges each season brought. A Neanderthal 40,000 years ago has no idea that they're part of a declining population. Their group size seems normal. Game is adequate, maybe a bit harder to find than their grandparents described, but adequate. The strange humans they sometimes encounter, the taller, more slender ones with the different tools, are just another factor in a complex world, not an existential threat. And yet, the end is coming. Inexorably, one failed group at a time, one generation that doesn't quite replace itself, one local population that winks out and doesn't get recolonized because there aren't enough Neanderthals left to expand into empty territory. By 37,000 years ago, Neanderthals are gone from most of Europe. A few populations persist in southern Spain and Portugal, refugees where they hang on for another few thousand years. But these are remnants, isolated, probably genetically impoverished. Around 35,000 years ago, even these last populations disappear. And then there's only one type of human left. Your ancestors. Modern Homo sapiens, spreading into every corner of the planet, the only survivors of what was once a diverse array of human species. As you're lying there tonight, perhaps you can feel the weight of this. You exist because your ancestors survived an encounter that the Neanderthals didn't. Not because they were better in any absolute sense, but because the specific combination of their traits, strategies, and circumstances aligned with the demands of that particular moment in history. It could have gone differently. There are no guarantees in evolution. A few different climate shifts, a few different population movements, a few different innovations, and maybe Neanderthals would have been the ones to spread globally while modern humans went extinct or were absorbed. The outcome wasn't inevitable. It was contingent, dependent on thousands of small factors and random events and individual choices. The weight of history of all the humans who came before you rests on an accumulation of tiny advantages and fortunate accidents and sheer persistence in the face of impossible challenges. Your ancestors came out of Africa into an unknown world. They met other humans who'd been there far longer, who knew the landscape and the climate and the game animals, and somehow through a combination of innovation and adaptation and demographic advantage and luck, they not only survived but spread. And in spreading they carried with them a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, the gift, or the remnant, of those ancient encounters. The genetic traces of the humans who didn't make it, preserved in the descendants of those who did. The story of modern humans arriving in Europe isn't simple. It's not conquest or replacement in any straightforward sense. It's thousands of years of complex interactions between populations that were similar enough to interbreed, but different enough to compete. It's the slow, grinding demographic mathematics of population growth and decline. It's the role of chance and climate and culture in determining outcomes. And it's the beginning of the world as it is today, populated by a single human species, but carrying within our genomes the traces of those we met and absorbed and outlasted along the way. Think about your own experience with this story so far. We've walked through the world of 45,000 years ago, met the Neanderthals in their Ice Age domain, followed the modern humans as they expanded out of Africa. But how do we actually know any of this? How do researchers piece together a story from fragmentary bones and scattered stone tools? How certain can we be about any of it? This is the part of the story that's often invisible. The detective work, the careful analysis, the painstaking reconstruction of the past from scraps of evidence that survived against all odds. Because here's the reality. Almost nothing from 45,000 years ago survives. Soft tissues rot away in years. Wood decays in decades. Bone can last longer, but usually doesn't. What we have is a tiny biased sample of what once existed. And from that tiny sample, we're trying to understand not just what happened, but why. Not just the physical artifacts, but the human experiences, motivations, feelings. We're trying to reconstruct not just the outer facts of past lives, but the inner reality of being human in a world that doesn't exist anymore. So let's examine the evidence. Let's look at what we actually have, how we interpret it, where the gaps are, what we're uncertain about. Because understanding the limits of our knowledge is as important as understanding what we think we know. Start with the most basic question. How do we know Neanderthals and modern humans met at all? The answer comes in layers, different types of evidence pointing to the same conclusion. First, the geographic evidence. We find Neanderthal remains and artifacts across Europe and Western Asia, dating from about 400,000 years ago to about 35,000 years ago. We find modern human remains and artifacts starting around 45,000 years ago in the same regions. The ranges overlap, temporally and spatially. The two populations must have encountered each other. But overlap in ranges doesn't prove interaction. For that, we need more direct evidence. And we have it, in several forms. The genetic evidence is the most clear-cut. When researchers first sequenced the Neanderthal genome, extracted from bone samples from Neanderthal sites, they compared it to modern human genomes. And they found something unexpected. Non-African populations, Europeans, Asians, Native Americans, everyone whose ancestors left Africa, carry between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA. This isn't ancient DNA shared from a common ancestor millions of years ago. This is recent gene flow, DNA transferred from Neanderthals to modern humans through interbreeding. And we can date it roughly. The pattern of DNA distribution suggests that the admixture happened between 50,000 and 60,000 years ago, probably in the Levant or nearby regions, when modern humans were first expanding out of Africa and encountering Neanderthal populations. The implications are profound. Interbreeding doesn't happen casually across species barriers. For children to result, for those children to survive and reproduce, the two populations had to be compatible enough, genetically, anatomically, behaviourally, to form relationships, conceive, and raise offspring together. They had to recognise each other as potential mates, as fellow humans, as similar enough that procreation made sense. Now, the admixture wasn't symmetric. Modern humans carry Neanderthal DNA, but Neanderthal remains we've sequenced don't show modern human DNA. This suggests the gene flow went primarily one direction, from Neanderthals into modern human populations. Why? Several possibilities. Maybe most hybrid children were raised in modern human groups rather than Neanderthal groups. Maybe modern human populations were larger, so even a small amount of admixture got diluted and spread widely. Maybe some Neanderthal genes provided advantages in the Eurasian environment, immune system adaptations, cold tolerance, and were selected for, spreading beyond what random chance would predict. The pattern of which Neanderthal genes survived is interesting. Some regions of the genome show high Neanderthal ancestry, genes involved in skin and hair, in immune response, in adaptation to UV radiation and climate. Other regions show almost no Neanderthal DNA, particularly genes involved in brain function and fertility. This suggests that some Neanderthal genes were beneficial, others were neutral, and some were actively harmful and were selected against. The X chromosome shows particularly low Neanderthal ancestry. This might indicate genetic incompatibilities. Hybrid males might have had reduced fertility, leading to selection against Neanderthal X chromosomes. This is common in species hybridization and fits with the idea that Neanderthals and modern humans, while capable of interbreeding, were at the edges of genetic compatibility. But genes are just one type of evidence. What about the archaeological record? What do the sites themselves tell us? Here's where things get complicated. We have thousands of sites across Europe and Asia with evidence of human occupation. Some are clearly Neanderthal, the tools are Mysterian, the remains are anatomically Neanderthal. Some are clearly modern human, the tools are Upper Paleolithic, the remains are anatomically modern. But some sites are ambiguous. There are sites where Neanderthal and modern human artifacts appear in the same or adjacent layers. Does this mean they lived there at the same time? Or did one population leave and another moved in later, reoccupying the same cave or shelter? Dating is rarely precise enough to know for certain. Radiocarbon dates have error ranges of hundreds of years, sometimes thousands. Two populations could be separated by centuries, but our dating methods can't resolve the difference. Even more interesting are sites where Neanderthals appear to be using tools that look more like modern human technology. In some late Neanderthal sites we find blade technology, bone tools, even personal ornaments like perforated shells. Did Neanderthals invent these independently? Or did they learn by observing modern humans, adopting new techniques from their neighbours? This is hotly debated. Some researchers argue that Neanderthals were perfectly capable of innovation and developed these technologies themselves. Others suggest that the timing, these advanced tools appearing only after modern humans arrived in the regions, is too coincidental. The technologies were probably borrowed or learned through observation and imitation. Both explanations have implications. If Neanderthals learned from modern humans, it suggests they were cognitively capable of understanding and replicating complex technologies. It suggests observation, perhaps even communication between the groups, but it also suggests they weren't innovating these technologies on their own, that they needed the stimulus of seeing modern humans use them first. Let's look at specific sites where both populations left traces. These are the closest we can get to seeing the encounter directly. The site of Saint-Césaire in France has a Neanderthal skeleton associated with what's called Châtel-Perronian tools, a toolkit that includes some blade technology and bone tools, intermediate between classic Mysterian and modern human Upper Paleolithic. The Châtel-Perronian appears in France right as modern humans are arriving in the region. Coincidence or evidence of cultural exchange? The Grotte du Renne at Arcis-sur-Cure, also in France, has Châtel-Perronian tools and Neanderthal remains. But it also has personal ornaments, perforated animal teeth, worked bone pendants. Did Neanderthals make these, or did they acquire them from modern humans through trade or scavenging? The association is controversial, with some researchers questioning whether the ornaments and the Neanderthal remains are truly from the same occupation or got mixed together by later disturbance. In the Levant there are sites like Amud and Kabara, where Neanderthal and modern human occupations alternate over thousands of years. The same caves, used by both populations at different times. This suggests they knew about the same good locations, valued the same features, shelter from weather, proximity to water, views over game trails. But did they ever meet directly at these sites? We can't know for certain. What we don't find is smoking gun evidence of violence between the two populations. No battle sites, no mass graves, no clear evidence of one population systematically killing the other. This is important. It suggests that while competition was real, outright warfare probably wasn't the primary mode of interaction. Some individual Neanderthal skeletons show trauma that could be from interpersonal violence, but we can't tell if that violence was with other Neanderthals or with modern humans, or with some other threat entirely. The wounds healed, suggesting the individual survived, which doesn't fit with genocidal warfare. The absence of battle sites might just mean we haven't found them. Violence in small groups wouldn't leave obvious archaeological traces. Or it might mean that most interaction was avoidance or low-level competition rather than open conflict. Groups keeping to their own territories, moving away when they encountered others, occasionally clashing but not systematically attempting to exterminate each other. Now let's talk about one of the most contentious pieces of evidence, the question of whether Neanderthals and modern humans could communicate. We know both populations had the anatomy for speech. Both had the FOXP2 gene in its modern form. Both had descended larynxes and similar vocal tract structures. So anatomically, vocal communication was possible. But could a Neanderthal and a modern human actually understand each other? Language evolves fast. Modern humans separated by a few thousand years, say ancient Egyptian and modern English, speak mutually unintelligible languages. Neanderthals and modern humans were separated for 500,000 years. Even if both had language, the vocabularies and grammars and phonologies could be completely different. Or maybe not. Maybe there's something universal about how human language works, some fundamental structure that all languages share. Maybe two humans meeting, even from long-separated populations, could find common ground through gesture, demonstration, shared context. Maybe language learning abilities are strong enough that with sufficient contact, individuals could learn each other's speech. We don't know, but if interbreeding happened, if relationships formed, some level of communication must have been possible. You don't form intimate enough bonds to have children without any ability to communicate. Maybe it was mostly gestural. Maybe it was pidgin language, simplified communication mixing elements from both sides. Maybe some individuals were better at it than others, becoming intermediaries or translators between groups. The evidence for what we might call cultural exchange is tantalizing but ambiguous. Some Neanderthal sites late in their history show innovations that appear to be borrowed from modern humans. But is this cultural exchange, deliberate sharing of knowledge, or independent invention or simple observation and imitation? The personal ornaments are the most interesting case. If Neanderthals started making shell beads and bone pendants after encountering modern humans who were making them, it suggests they understood these objects had meaning, had value. They weren't just copying the physical form, but grasping the symbolic significance. This is sophisticated social cognition, understanding that objects can carry meaning beyond their physical properties, but again the evidence is debatable. Every Neanderthal site with personal ornaments has been challenged. Questions about dating, about whether the ornaments are truly associated with Neanderthal remains, about whether they might have been scavenged from modern human sites rather than made by Neanderthals. This is the nature of archaeology. Every interpretation can be questioned, every association might be accidental. We're working with fragmentary evidence, disturbed by thousands of years of geological processes, trying to reconstruct human behaviours from objects that survive when the humans themselves are dust. Let's shift to the question of climate and environment. Because the world Neanderthals and modern humans inhabited was changing rapidly, and those changes might have been more important than any interaction between the populations. The late Pleistocene, from 60,000 to 35,000 years ago, was a time of dramatic climate instability. We're not talking about gradual warming or cooling over thousands of years. We're talking about shifts that happened in decades or even years. Temperature drops of 10 degrees Celsius within a century, rainfall patterns changing dramatically, vegetation zones shifting hundreds of kilometers. These shifts are visible in ice cores from Greenland, in ocean sediment cores, in cave formations and lake deposits. The climate during this period was bouncing around wildly, creating enormous challenges for any population trying to maintain stable subsistence strategies. Each climate shift would stress both Neanderthal and modern human populations. Cold snaps would reduce plant productivity, shift animal migration routes, make survival more difficult. Warm periods might bring different challenges, forests replacing grasslands, changing the prey species available, requiring different hunting strategies. But populations under different levels of stress respond differently to environmental challenges. A population that's already declining, already struggling with competition and reduced resources, is more vulnerable to climate shocks. A growing population with diverse subsistence strategies and large social networks is more resilient. This might be the key to understanding Neanderthal extinction. Not that they couldn't handle climate change, they'd survived dramatic climate swings for hundreds of thousands of years, but that they couldn't handle climate change plus competition with modern humans, plus whatever demographic challenges they were already facing. The combination proved fatal where individual factors might have been survivable. There's also the question of population size and connectivity. Modern human populations seem to have been larger and more densely connected. If modern human groups were in regular contact, trading information and materials and genes, they'd have access to innovations from a larger pool of people. Successful ideas would spread faster. Failed groups could be recolonized from neighboring populations. Neanderthals in smaller, more isolated groups wouldn't have these advantages. Each group would be more on its own, more dependent on local knowledge and resources, more vulnerable to local failures. A harsh winter that wipes out a small Neanderthal group might create a permanent gap in their range. A similar disaster for a modern human group might be temporary because neighbours could expand into the empty territory. Over thousands of years, these differences compound. Small demographic advantages for modern humans become larger. Neanderthal range contracts. Populations fragment, genetic diversity drops, resilience decreases. Eventually, you reach a tipping point where the remaining Neanderthals can't sustain viable populations, and extinction becomes inevitable. Let's talk about the last Neanderthals, the final populations clinging to existence in southern Spain and Portugal around 35,000 years ago. These sites are poignant. Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar, occupied until about 32,000 years ago. Jarama 6 in central Spain, possibly as late as 33,000 years ago. These were refuges, places where Neanderthals persisted after they disappeared from the rest of Europe. Why these locations? Probably climate. Southern Iberia was relatively warm and stable, less affected by the climate extremes hitting northern Europe. The Mediterranean coastline provided diverse resources: shellfish, fish, marine mammals, plus the usual terrestrial game. It was a good place to survive, but these populations were isolated, cut off from other Neanderthals, if any others still existed. The archaeological evidence suggests small groups, probably genetically impoverished from isolation and inbreeding. They were maintaining their traditional Mysterian technology, still hunting, still using the caves and rock shelters their ancestors had used. But modern humans were in Iberia by this time too. Not everywhere, not dominating, but present. The two populations must have been aware of each other. Did they interact? Did these last Neanderthals ever encounter modern humans? Or were they so isolated, so few, that contact was rare or non-existent? We don't know. What we know is that around 32,000 to 35,000 years ago, even these last populations disappear. The youngest reliably dated Neanderthal remains are from this period. After that, nothing. No more Neanderthal sites, no more Neanderthal bones, just modern humans spreading into every region, becoming the only type of human left. The moment of extinction, the death of the very last Neanderthal individual, we'll never be able to identify. It wasn't recorded, it wasn't mourned except possibly by the few surviving group members. It was just a death, one more in the endless chain of deaths that defines mortality. But it was also the end of a lineage stretching back hundreds of thousands of years, the final closing of a branch of the human family tree. Did that last Neanderthal know they were the last? Almost certainly not. They probably assumed there were others out there, other groups in other valleys, maintaining the old ways. They had no way to know that the world had changed irrevocably, that their kind was over, that the future belonged entirely to the other humans. As you're lying there now, perhaps you can feel the tragedy of this. An entire way of being human, developed over hundreds of thousands of years, refined through countless generations, perfectly adapted to the Ice Age world, simply ending. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. The last Neanderthal dying alone or in a small group, unaware that they were the end of their species. But let's also acknowledge the uncertainty. Everything we've discussed is our best interpretation of limited evidence. New discoveries could change the picture dramatically. A new site with better preservation, a new dating technique, a new genetic analysis. Any of these could revise our understanding. There are still huge gaps in our knowledge. We don't know exactly when and where modern humans first encountered Neanderthals. We don't know the details of how they interacted, how often they fought, traded, cooperated, interbred. We don't know whether language barriers existed or how they were overcome. We don't know whether disease played a role in Neanderthal decline. We don't know for certain why Neanderthals disappeared while modern humans spread. What we have are hypotheses, models, reconstructions based on fragmentary evidence. Some are well supported, others more speculative. The responsible approach is to acknowledge these limitations while working with the best evidence available. The story we've told over these hours is based on decades of research by thousands of scientists working with stone tools, bones, genes, climate data, cave deposits, everything that survived from the Pleistocene. It's the best reconstruction we can currently make, but it's not final, it's not complete. It's a work in progress, constantly being revised as new evidence emerges. And that's appropriate, because we're trying to understand something profoundly complex, the encounter between two types of human, the interplay of biology and culture and environment, the role of chance and choice in shaping outcomes. We're trying to understand not just what happened, but why. And why is always harder than what. The Neanderthals left us traces, stone tools scattered across hundreds of sites, bones in caves and rock shelters, DNA in our genomes, enough to reconstruct an outline of their existence, to understand their capabilities, to appreciate their humanity, but not enough to know them as individuals, to understand their thoughts and feelings and motivations, to see the world through their eyes. We'll never know what a Neanderthal thought standing on a hilltop watching the sun set over the mammoth steppe. We'll never know how they felt about the strange tall humans they sometimes encountered. We'll never know if they sensed that their world was changing, that something fundamental was shifting in the late Pleistocene. All we have are the traces they left behind, and from those traces, we do our best to honour their memory, to tell their story as accurately as we can, to ensure they're not forgotten completely despite being gone for 35,000 years. This is what archaeology is, the study of the dead through the fragmentary evidence they left behind. It's inherently limited, inevitably speculative, constantly provisional, but it's also the only way we have to understand our deep past, to connect with the humans who came before us, to trace the long, strange journey that led from the first humans in Africa to you, lying in your bed tonight, listening to a story about people who've been gone for millennia. The Neanderthals were real. They lived and loved and struggled and survived for hundreds of thousands of years. They met your ancestors and interacted in ways we're still trying to understand, and then they were gone, leaving only fragments and memories encoded in stone and bone and DNA. Their story is part of your story, their genes are part of your genome. Their encounter with your ancestors shaped who you are, what traits you carry, what possibilities your existence represents. They're not distant strangers, they're family, however distant. The cousins who didn't make it, but who touched the lineage that did. And in trying to understand them, in piecing together their story from the fragments they left, we learn something about ourselves, about what it means to be human, about the thin line between survival and extinction, about the role of chance and adaptation and persistence in shaping outcomes. We learn that being human is more diverse, than the single form it takes today. That there have been other ways of being human, other solutions to the problem of survival, other paths that human evolution took before those paths ended. And we learn humility. Because we're the survivors, yes, but that doesn't make us superior. We're the lucky ones, the ones whose ancestors happen to have the right traits at the right time in the right place. The Neanderthals were magnificent in their own way, perfectly adapted to their world, successful beyond measure by any reasonable standard. They just encountered circumstances they couldn't overcome. That could be us someday. That could be any species at any time. Survival is never guaranteed. Success in one era doesn't predict success in the next. The world changes, and sometimes even the most successful adaptations become liabilities. The Neanderthals teach us that. They remind us that nothing lasts forever, that all lineages eventually end, that the most we can hope for is to persist for a while, to leave traces for those who come after, to be remembered if only by the fragments we leave behind. Here's the part of the story that's often missing from discussions about Neanderthals and modern humans. We talk about who survived and who didn't. We analyse the competitive dynamics, the technological differences, the demographic advantages. We treat it as a story about winning and losing, about the fit and the unfit, about evolutionary success and failure. But there's another way to understand this encounter, not as a competition with winners and losers, but as a meeting that fundamentally shaped what it means to be human today. Not as the extinction of one population and the triumph of another, but as a complex mixing and merging that created something new. Us, with our Neanderthal genes and our modern human culture and our inheritance from both lineages. The encounter between Neanderthals and modern humans wasn't just about replacement. It was about exchange, about what each population gave to the other, about how the meeting changed both groups in ways we're still discovering. So let's talk about the gifts. The things Neanderthals gave to modern humans that persist in us today. Start with the most obvious gift, the genetic one. That 1% to 4% of Neanderthal DNA in non-African populations isn't random junk. It's functional genetic material that's been maintained by the natural selection for 50,000 years because it provides advantages. Researchers have identified specific genes of Neanderthal origin that help modern humans in concrete ways. Immune system genes are particularly important. Neanderthals had been living in Europe and Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, encountering pathogens that modern humans from Africa had never experienced. When modern humans arrived, they were immunologically naive to these diseases, but Neanderthals had evolved resistance, developed immune responses, adapted to the local disease environment. When interbreeding happened, modern humans didn't just get Neanderthal children, they got Neanderthal immune genes. Genes that help fight off European and Asian diseases. Genes that recognize pathogens modern human immune systems had never encountered. This was huge. Disease is one of the biggest killers when populations enter new territories. The genetic gift from Neanderthals might have made the difference between successful colonization and catastrophic die-off. Today, some of these immune genes are still in you. If you're of European or Asian descent, you carry Neanderthal variants of genes like TLR1, TLR6, and TLR10, toll-like receptors that recognize bacterial and viral invaders. You're better at fighting certain infections because Neanderthals, tens of thousands of years ago, developed those capabilities and passed them to your ancestors. There are other genetic gifts too. Genes involved in skin and hair, helping modern humans adapt to the UV radiation levels and climate of Europe. Genes involved in fat metabolism, possibly helping process the high-protein, high-fat Ice Age diet. Genes involved in cold tolerance, adaptation to the northern climates that modern humans from Africa weren't initially adapted to. Some of these Neanderthal genes show strong positive selection. They spread far beyond what random chance would predict because they provided real advantages. Modern humans weren't just absorbing Neanderthal genes passively. Natural selection was actively favouring some of them, spreading them widely through populations, incorporating them into the modern human genome because they worked. This is profound. You're not purely descended from the modern humans who left Africa. You're a hybrid. A combination of modern human and Neanderthal ancestry carrying genes from both lineages. The distinction between us and them, between modern humans and Neanderthals, isn't absolute. We merged. We became something neither population was before. Now, let's talk about a different kind of gift. Cultural exchange. What did modern humans learn from Neanderthals? This is harder to trace than genetics because culture doesn't fossilize as clearly as DNA. But there are hints. Some researchers have suggested that modern humans arriving in Europe adopted certain Neanderthal technologies or strategies. The use of specific stone types found only in Neanderthal territories. Hunting techniques that might have been borrowed from observing Neanderthal methods. Knowledge about local resources, plant foods, seasonal patterns. Imagine you're a modern human group moving into new territory. You don't know this landscape. You don't know where to find the best stone for tools, where water sources are reliable, which plants are edible, how animals behave in this climate. But Neanderthals have been here for hundreds of thousands of years. They know everything about this environment. If you can learn from them, through observation, through occasional peaceful contact, through captured or integrated individuals who share knowledge, you have a huge advantage. You skip the trial and error learning that would normally take generations. You accelerate your adaptation to the new environment by learning from those who already mastered it. This might be part of why modern human expansion into Europe was successful when earlier attempts failed. The modern humans who arrived 50,000 years ago weren't just relying on their own knowledge. They were learning from Neanderthals, incorporating Neanderthal environmental knowledge into their own cultural repertoire. There's a third gift too, one that's more abstract but possibly more important. The gift of humility, of perspective, of understanding that being human is more complex than we thought. For most of human history, we assumed we were alone. The only human species, the pinnacle of evolution, the inevitable endpoint of the human lineage. The discovery of Neanderthals, the understanding that they were fully human but different, that there were other ways of being human that worked for hundreds of thousands of years, this fundamentally changed how we see ourselves. We're not the inevitable result of evolution. We're one possible outcome among many. The traits we have, the ways we think and behave, these aren't the only way to be human. They're just the version that survived. Other humans, equally valid, equally successful by their own measures, took different paths. This understanding has moral implications. It suggests we should be humble about our own success, recognizing that we're here partly through luck and circumstance, rather than inevitable superiority. It suggests we should be curious about other ways of being, other solutions to problems, other paths not taken. It suggests that diversity, variation, multiple approaches, these are valuable rather than deviations from some ideal type. The Neanderthals teach us that humanity is bigger, stranger, more diverse than the single form it takes today. And that's a gift too, the expansion of our understanding of what human means. Now let's talk about what this encounter reveals about human nature more broadly, about how we respond to difference, how we handle the other, how we balance cooperation and competition. The Neanderthal modern human encounter shows us the full range of human responses to the other. We see evidence of violence, some skeletons with trauma, some population decline that might reflect conflict. We see evidence of avoidance, populations using the same territories but at different times, possibly to avoid confrontation. And we see evidence of cooperation and intimacy, the interbreeding that must have involved some level of mutual acceptance, relationship formation, peaceful enough contact for children to result. This is recognizably human behavior. We do the same things today when encountering different groups. Sometimes we fight, sometimes we avoid, sometimes we cooperate and form relationships. The encounter 45,000 years ago wasn't fundamentally different from encounters throughout human history. The scale was different, the stakes were different, but the behavioral patterns were similar. This suggests something important. The capacity for both violence and cooperation, for both xenophobia and acceptance, for both competition and mutualism, these are deep parts of human nature. They were operating 45,000 years ago, and they're operating now. Understanding this doesn't excuse the violence or celebrate the cooperation. It just helps us see that these tendencies are old, a part of our evolutionary inheritance, are things we need to consciously manage rather than assuming we've transcended them. Let's shift to a different question. What does it mean that Neanderthals went extinct? How should we think about that outcome? There's a tendency to see extinction as failure. The Neanderthals failed because they went extinct. Modern humans succeeded because they survived. But this is too simple. By most measures, Neanderthals were incredibly successful. They persisted as a distinct population for 300,000 years or more. They adapted to enormous climate swings. They occupied a vast geographic range. They developed sophisticated tools and culture and social structures. The fact that they eventually went extinct doesn't erase those successes. All species eventually go extinct, except for the ones that evolve into something else. Persistence is temporary. The question isn't whether a species eventually goes extinct, but how long it persists, how well it adapts, whether it leaves descendants or contributions to later forms. By these measures, Neanderthals were successful. They persisted for 3 times as long as modern humans have existed, as a distinct species so far. They adapted brilliantly to their environment, and they left both genetic and cultural contributions to the population that replaced them. If we measure success by these standards rather than just by survival to the present, Neanderthals look pretty good. They were successful humans who happened to encounter circumstances they couldn't overcome. That's not failure, that's the normal course of evolutionary history. This reframing is as important. It helps us see Neanderthals not as primitive failures, but as successful humans whose time ended. It helps us recognize that our own survival isn't proof of superiority, just proof of luck and adaptation to specific circumstances. It gives us perspective on our own place in evolutionary history. We're currently successful, but that could change, and our value isn't determined solely by whether we persist into the far future. Now let's talk about what this story means for you personally, lying there tonight, carrying a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, descended from the populations who survived the encounter. You exist because of a complex series of events that could have gone differently at hundreds of points. If modern humans hadn't left Africa, or if they'd failed to adapt to Eurasia, or if Neanderthal populations had been larger and more resilient, the outcome might have been different. You might not be here. Or you might be here but with a different mixture of modern human and Neanderthal ancestry. Or Neanderthal descendants might be the ones dominant today, wondering about the extinct population of the modern humans. The contingency of your existence is humbling. You're not the inevitable result of progress. You're the current outcome of a long series of events shaped by chance and circumstance as much as by any inherent superiority of your ancestors. This doesn't make you less valuable, but it does make you luckier than you might have realized. You also carry inheritance from both populations. Your immune system benefits from Neanderthal genes. Your physical traits might be influenced by a Neanderthal ancestry. Your existence as a modern human includes contributions from the Neanderthals, making you a hybrid of sorts, a combination of both lineages. This should create a sense of connection to the Neanderthals. They're not completely gone. Part of them persists in you. When you fight off an infection using immune genes of Neanderthal origin, when you adapt to cold or processed fats, or any of the other functions influenced by Neanderthal ancestry, you're benefiting from their evolutionary history. They're still here, in a way, still contributing to human survival through the genes they passed on. Let's talk about how to make peace with this story, how to hold the complexity of it, the tragedy and the triumph, the extinction and the persistence, the violence and the intimacy. First, recognize that this isn't a simple story with clear heroes and villains. Modern humans weren't evil for outcompeting Neanderthals. Neanderthals weren't inferior for going extinct. Both were populations of humans trying to survive in a challenging world, making the best decisions they could with the information they had, shaped by evolutionary and cultural forces beyond their individual control. The outcome, Neanderthal extinction, modern human expansion, was the result of countless small factors and random events compounding over thousands of years. No individual modern human or Neanderthal was responsible for the overall pattern. They were just living their lives, hunting and gathering and raising children, while larger demographic and ecological forces played out around them. Second, appreciate what we've learned from reconstructing this story. We've gained enormous insight into human evolution, into how populations interact, into the role of genetics and culture and environment in shaping outcomes. We've learned about the diversity of human forms, the complexity of our history, the contingency of our existence. This knowledge is valuable. It helps us understand ourselves better. It provides perspective on our current situation as a species. It reminds us that the present is temporary, that change is constant, that survival is never guaranteed. Third, honour the Neanderthals for who they were, not primitive cavemen, but successful Ice Age humans who survived in one of the harshest environments on Earth for hundreds of thousands of years. They were intelligent, adaptive, culturally sophisticated, fully human in all the ways that matter. They loved their children and cared for their sick and made beautiful tools and possibly even created art. They deserve to be remembered accurately, respectfully, as fellow humans who took a different path. They deserve to be honoured for their successes, not just marked as evolutionary losers. Their story is part of our story, their extinction part of the complex history that led to the present. Fourth, recognise the gifts they gave us, the genetic contributions that still benefit us today, the possible cultural knowledge that helped modern humans adapt to Europe, the perspective they provide on what it means to be human, the reminder that our way isn't the only way, that other solutions to the problem of being human have existed and worked. These aren't small gifts, they're fundamental contributions to who we are, what we can do, how we understand ourselves. We owe the Neanderthals gratitude, not pity, respect, not condescension. As you're lying there now, as the night deepens around you, perhaps you can feel the weight of this inheritance. You're connected to the Neanderthals through genes and through history. Their story is part of your story. Their extinction is part of the complex web of events that led to your existence. This isn't cause for guilt. You didn't cause their extinction. That happened tens of thousands of years before you were born, and it was the result of forces no individual controlled. But it might be cause for reflection, for thinking about how populations interact, how competition works, how success and failure are defined, how we should understand our own place in the long arc of evolutionary history. You're a survivor of an encounter that changed the human species. Your ancestors were the ones who made it through the demographic bottleneck, who adapted successfully to new environments, who had the right combination of traits and strategies and luck to persist. That's remarkable. That's worth appreciating. But you also carry the traces of those who didn't make it as distinct populations. The Neanderthals are in you, literally, in your genes. Their legacy persists even though they're gone as a separate people. That's worth honouring, worth remembering, worth being grateful for. The story of Neanderthals and modern humans meeting 45,000 years ago is ultimately a human story. Not about two alien species colliding, but about two varieties of human encountering each other and interacting in ways that were sometimes violent, sometimes peaceful, sometimes intimate. About populations navigating competition and cooperation. About individuals forming relationships across population boundaries. About the complex outcomes when different versions of humanity meet. And the lesson from this story, if there is one, is that being human is more diverse, more complex, more contingent than we often acknowledge. There have been other ways of being human. There might be other ways in the future if we diverge enough or encounter enough environmental variation. The particular form humanity takes today isn't fixed, isn't inevitable, isn't the only possibility. The Neanderthals prove this. They were a different way of being human that worked brilliantly for hundreds of thousands of years. That they're gone now doesn't invalidate their success or their humanity. It just means that circumstances changed, that the world they were adapted to transformed, that the competition they faced proved unsurmountable. That could happen to us. We're not immune to extinction just because we're currently successful. If the environment changes dramatically enough, if we encounter competition we can't handle, if demographic factors turn against us, modern humans could go the way of Neanderthals. Survival is never permanent. Success is always temporary. The best we can hope for is to persist for a while, to adapt as circumstances change, to leave some trace for whatever comes after. The Neanderthals left their trace, in genes, in stone tools, in the knowledge we've painstakingly reconstructed from fragmentary evidence. They are not completely lost, they are not forgotten. Their story is part of the human story, their contribution is part of what makes modern humans what we are. And so, as this long night comes to an end, as we've walked through 45,000 years of human history, through the Ice Age landscapes and the scattered archaeological sites and the complex genetic evidence, perhaps we can arrive at a place of appreciation. For the Neanderthals, who were human in their own way and successful by any reasonable measure, for the modern humans who adapted and persisted and eventually spread across the planet, for the encounter between them that shaped both populations and created new possibilities. You're the result of that encounter, the descendant of survivors carrying genes from both lineages, inheriting a complex history that includes both triumph and tragedy. Your existence is contingent on thousands of events that could have gone differently. You're lucky to be here. Lucky that your ancestors survived. Lucky that the encounter happened in a way that allowed gene flow, that preserved Neanderthal contributions even as Neanderthals as distinct population disappeared. This is your inheritance. This is your history. This is part of what makes you human. Not just the modern human anatomy and behaviour, but the Neanderthal genes, the complex past, the encounters and exchanges and competitions that shaped the human species over tens of thousands of years. And now, finally, you can rest. The story has been told. The encounter has been explored. The Neanderthals have been honoured. The modern humans understood. The complexity acknowledged. The past is still past, still gone, still preserved only in fragments and traces. But those fragments tell a story worth knowing, a story about who we are, where we came from, what it means to be human in a world that once held more diversity than it does today. The Neanderthals in their cave 45,000 years ago, the ones we imagined at the beginning of this journey, they lived and died never knowing how their story would end. They couldn't see the future, couldn't predict the outcome, couldn't know that they were part of a larger pattern of population replacement and mixing and change. But they were human. They felt and thought and loved and suffered. They survived as long as they could in a world that was difficult and beautiful and unforgiving. They did their best with what they had. And when their time ended, they left behind enough traces that we, tens of thousands of years later, can reconstruct their story and honour their memory. Sleep now, dream of Ice Age landscapes under vast starry skies. Dream of humans who are like you and unlike you, who face challenges you'll never encounter, who survive through intelligence and strength and cooperation and luck. Dream of the long, strange story of how you came to exist, the countless generations that had to survive for you to be here, the encounters and accidents and adaptations that shaped your inheritance. You come from survivors, from modern humans who left Africa and adapted to new worlds, from Neanderthals who mastered the Ice Age and left genetic gifts that still benefit you today, from the mixing of both lineages, the complex encounter that created something new, modern humans as they exist in the present, carrying traces of all the populations that came before. This is your story. This is your history. This is part of what makes you who you are. And tonight, that's enough. Tomorrow you can carry this knowledge forward, this understanding of human complexity and contingency and resilience, But for now, just rest. The encounter between Neanderthals and modern humans happened 45,000 years ago. The outcome is fixed, the story over, but the legacy persists. In genes, in knowledge, in the understanding that being human is more diverse and complex than we often recognize. You're part of that legacy. You're the present moment in a story that stretches back hundreds of thousands of years and will continue far into the future. You're a link in the chain, connecting past to future, carrying forward the inheritance of all the humans who came before. Rest now. Let the weight of this history settle gently around you. Let the knowledge of your connection to both Neanderthals and modern humans provide comfort rather than burden. Let the understanding that you exist at all against enormous odds create gratitude for the chance to be here. The Neanderthals are gone, modern humans spread across the world. The encounter shaped both populations in ways we were still discovering. And you, lying here tonight, carry the legacy of all of it. Your ancestors would be proud that you're here, that you survived, that you carry their inheritance forward into an unknown future. Good night.